Matthew 7 is where I'd like for you to turn tonight. Matthew 7, as most in this audience would know, Matthew 5 is where I want you to turn. Matthew 5 through 7, of course, is Matthew's account of Jesus' message that we typically call the Sermon on the Mount. Most people say that there are 8 Beatitudes. I would be one of those. I don't know. They're not calculated by this is number 1, number 2. But I would say 8 would suffice. There are 8. But the last one really involves the 3 verses that I want to focus our attention on tonight as we think about a few things. I want to begin reading in verse 10 of Matthew, the 5th chapter, where Jesus, as he closes this part of the sermon, apparently, he says this: "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." I believe that Jesus intended not only these Beatitudes, but really everything that is recorded in Matthew 5 to 7. I think he intended for all of these things to be things that would define a Christian, that would form the character for these who would ultimately be asked to be kingdom citizens. That's something you typically hear when someone's talking about these 3 chapters, but I think that's because it's true. Jesus is saying this is who a kingdom citizen is. This is what he or she is like. And initially, these Beatitudes form some things and some ideas that people, if they become these, if they mourn and if they hunger and all the things that he mentions, if he says, if you do these things, then you will be the kind of person that God wants you to be. And I get, as I read the Beatitudes, and I didn't take the time to read all of them tonight, I get most of these Beatitudes. Not only do I get it, I can relate to it. When Jesus says, if you hunger and thirst after righteousness, you'll be filled. I understand that. I understand that if you are hungry and thirsty to really involve yourself in righteousness, if that's what your aim and primary purpose is, that God is going to fill you. I get that idea. But verses 10, 11, and 12, I struggle with a little bit. And I struggle with them because really what first century Christians struggle with in terms of persecution is not what I struggle with. It's just not the same today for me. And my guess is it's just not the same for you today in terms of this persecution. When Jesus says in verse 12, "Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. They persecuted the prophets who were before you." And he spends, again, it's talked about, Matthew records the things that he says, and it takes 3 verses to say everything that he wants to say about this idea of if you're persecuted for righteousness' sake, that's a good thing. And yet, when I really stop and think about my life, and I want you to do the same right now, are you really persecuted? I mean, with the kind of persecution that Matthew records earlier in Matthew 2:16, when he talks about when the wise men came to Herod and he found out who was being born, and he said, "Well, what we're going to do? I'm going to just form an edict right now. We're going to kill all the male children in Bethlehem and in the vicinity of Bethlehem. We're just going to kill them all. And that ought to solve the problem." That doesn't happen here. Not exactly like that. Or when you read about in Acts about Stephen and about what goes on with him, in verses 8 through 12 of Acts 6, you see where the Jews attacked Stephen and they stoned him and they killed him. Now, that's not to say that there aren't people who are attacked and people who are stoned, but I'm going to tell you, I don't see that. That doesn't happen around here much that I know of. I mean, if somebody were to be attacked like that, my guess is that Florence's finest very quickly would show up and do their very best to take care of that situation so that that kind of situation wouldn't happen. So that's just not something that I really relate to. But those first century Christians did. When Jesus was speaking those 10 commandments, or rather those Beatitudes, here in Matthew 5 as he records those, while that had not happened with Stephen yet. I mean, there was that kind of persecution that was mounting. So when they heard Jesus say this, I think they were thinking something different than what I think. And then when you go to 2 Corinthians 11, and I do want you to turn there. Look at 2 Corinthians 11. There are really two places in the Corinthian letters. 2 Corinthians 4 mentions this at about I think it's verses 6 through 8. I don't want to look at that particular passage tonight, but I want you to look at 2 Corinthians 11 beginning in verse 23, because Paul would again reiterate some of the difficulties and sufferings which he had to deal with. So he says in verse 23, are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequently, in deaths often. From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have been in the deep, in journeys often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and toil and sleeplessness, often in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness, besides the other things what comes upon me daily, my deep concern for all the churches. Now, I read that pretty quickly. Did you hear all that? That's just stating some things that he went through. And it's not even giving us the specifics. But did you read all that? Did you hear all that? None of that has happened to me. Not one. He's talking about this. I was beaten 5 times, 40 stripes less 1. 5 different times. That's what he says. And I'm sure he remembered every one of those times. That's just one thing in a long list, in a litany of things that he says, this is what I've had to deal with. This is the kind of persecution I've had to deal with. That's what was going on in the first century. So when Jesus said, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, I don't get it like they got it. I cannot relate to any of that. Not the specifics of that. Not one of those things. I mean, there are a few things. When he talks about, my deep concern for all the churches, I don't even feel that like he felt it. I mean, he was the apostle to the Gentiles, and he was the apostle that taught folks initially. I mean, I don't feel any of that kind of thing. I'm concerned about you. And I'm concerned about Christians whom I know, and I'm concerned about others that I hope will obey the God. I'm concerned about it, but I don't have those kind of, not what Paul had. I don't have that kind of concern. So I can't even relate to that, really. But what does that mean? What does Matthew 5, when Jesus said, blessed are those that mourn, for they shall be comforted, that means something to us, doesn't it? When he says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, that means something to us, doesn't it? We always talk about that. We preach about that. We say, here are the Beatitudes, and we explain. Here's what he said. Here's what it means. Here's the way we ought to apply that, right? So they all apply somehow, right? So how does Matthew 5, 10 through 12 apply to us? If what was going on in the first century is not altogether what's going on now, and I'm not suggesting that it can't, or that it isn't anywhere, but that's not what's going on with me. How do we relate? Let me mention just a few things. When you're in a conversation with people and they're talking to you about, or in the course of the conversation, they're talking about things like sexual encounters or people living together when they're not married, or whether or not, what age do you think a person ought to be sexually active? Or questions like that just come up in the course of a conversation, and people begin to talk about those kind of things. And then you say, I hope you say, well, yeah, I don't believe it. I don't believe that a person needs to be sexually active until they're married. Matter of fact, I think that what the Bible teaches that a person ought to abstain from having any kind of sexual activity until they're married. Now, how does that go these days? How does that help the flow of the conversation these days? May I ask you that question? It pretty much shuts you off probably for the most part, unless you're talking to folks here and others who profess faith in God, and not all of them would agree with that. What happens when you say, well, I'll tell you what people need to do. They need to abstain from that. Abstinence is what people need to do because that's what's morally right. And to not abstain from that before marriage is morally wrong. And when you engage in that, you become a fornicator. And what Jesus said about fornication is people who are involved in fornication are not going to be in heaven. And people kind of look at you and go, well, then what are you saying? And you say, well, I'm telling you what Jesus said. How does that fly? Or how about what we all know now is a popular subject in circles, and that is, same-sex marriage, homosexuality, all those kind of things. And you have that conversation now. Oh, I'm hoping you still have that conversation. Say, well, I believe that's wrong. And what typically happens? And I know a lot of you, probably most of you, are in a work environment. You have to be careful what you say. You have to be careful how you act. You have to be careful. I'm not suggesting in any kind of way that you don't stand up for what God wants you to stand up for. But I'm telling you, my guess is that you have to think about it. How am I going to respond? What am I going to say? What's going to go in that file? And all I'm saying to you about all that is, if you stand up for the kinds of things that the Lord wants you to stand up for, you will be persecuted in some form or fashion. I mean, if you're unwilling to use the kind of language that a lot of people use, that it's becoming increasingly worse, that really does stun me. That words that 30 years ago would be unheard of now are becoming relatively frequent. And people just don't treat it the same way. Well, nothing really changed as far as how God views that. And for us to suggest that there is language that doesn't need to be used, and I would appreciate it if you wouldn't use that kind of language around me. What kind of approval does that meet with these days? Now, some people may say, I'm sorry. But a lot of people won't. Or how about anything that's morally unsound that the community adopts? Even a community that has for many years been relatively conservative morally, yet times they are a-changing. And so what happens? Well, it may not be the same type of persecution that was going on in the first century, although that may happen. I mean, the killing of people and the stoning of people for their faith, I mean, all that kind of thing may happen. But it's not happening now. But I do believe that what's happening in the 21st century is that we are facing things that if we do stand up for what we should stand up for, then we will face the kind of persecution that in the 21st century I think is the application of what Jesus was talking about to those first century Christians. And I would also suggest this, and I include myself in this. If we're not facing some of that, we may need to rethink how we are approaching some of these things. If we're not having some reaction of people of the world, we may need to think about whether or not we're vocal enough. We may need to consider whether or not we are willing to suffer persecution. We may need to reevaluate why we aren't saying what we may ought to be saying. And I realize there are ways to do it and ways not to do it. But if we're not being persecuted for standing up for the gospel of Jesus Christ, maybe we need to rethink whether or not we are standing up at all. So let me go to 1 Peter 4, and let me ask you to turn there as well. 1 Peter 4. And let's answer this question. How did they handle the persecution then? What did inspired writers ask of them? Well, if you go to 1 Peter 4, beginning in verse 12, I think this can help us. I see a few principles that I think are applicable to us that can help us through all this as well. Verse 12 of 1 Peter 4 says, "Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you. But rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when His glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. If you are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory and of God rest upon you. On their part He's blasphemed, but on your part He's glorified. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or as a busybody in other people's matters. Yet, if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this matter. For the time has come for judgment to begin at the house of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel of God? Now, if the righteous one is scarcely saved, where will the ungodly and the sinner appear? Therefore, let those who suffer according to the will of God commit their souls to Him in doing good as to a faithful Creator." As you looked at that, were there things in there that you automatically said, that's what I need to do. That's how I need to overcome this. That's how I need to deal with this. I think that's what Peter is saying to them, those in the first century, who I believe were facing primarily Jewish persecution. I don't think when this was written, the Roman persecution had even started yet. I think this was primarily those Christians who were facing Jewish persecution, and they were having to face that. And he calls this, he said, don't think it's strange. So the first thing I would suggest out of verse 12 is don't be surprised. Don't be surprised when people react adversely to you when you try to stand up for what's right. Just don't be surprised about that. He says, that's what he says here. Do not think it's strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you. He's saying, this is the way it is. And I don't know that he didn't say it here, but he may have said, this is what our master told us. He said, you're going to be persecuted for righteousness' sake. Don't think twice about it. Don't let it surprise you. And then verse 13, he says, but rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when His glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. So he says, keep on rejoicing. That's kind of a hard concept for us to understand. But I think basically what he's saying is when you are willing to stand up, just rejoice in the fact that you've been given that opportunity to stand and to say, I am a believer. And I'm not going to back down from what Jesus Christ has said. I believe it's the truth, and I believe it's what everybody ought to follow. But rejoice in the fact that you've been given that kind of opportunity. And then in verse 14 he said, if you are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you. You're blessed if you do that. And you're blessed because verse 16 says, you glorify God. Or really verse 14 says that as well. The Spirit of glory rests on you. Verse 16, if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this matter. And then in verse 17, Peter says, for the time has come for judgment to begin at the house of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel of God? Now, how he concludes that, he really concludes it by being negative and saying, it's got to begin with the house of God. First, all are going to be judged. There's going to be judgment fall on everybody. But what he says is, he talks about those who are unwilling to be persecuted. Because he says, what will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel of God? Now, if the righteous one is scarcely saved, where will the ungodly and the sinner appear? Which is to say, it's not going to be good if they're unwilling to do that. So he then concludes in verse 19 by saying, therefore then, let those who suffer according to the will of God commit their souls to Him in doing good to a faithful Creator. I have said this a lot. I think about it a lot because it's different. The world's different than it was when I was a younger man. But I think all of us should consider how we are, for lack of a better term, I would say, how are we promoting, that's not the right word, but it expresses maybe an idea, how we are promoting the idea of Christ and all the things that He wants us to stand for. And if we're doing that as we should, we are going to face not necessarily what those families in Bethlehem faced when Jesus was born, not necessarily those things that Stephen faced when he stood up for who he was, not necessarily all the things that Paul had to suffer, not necessarily those things, but I think there is an application for us that we've got to make sure we see. And so whether it's at school, or whether it's in the workplace, or whether it's at the coffee shop, or whether it's with family or friends, with associates, with teammates, with your brothers and sisters in Christ who may disagree with you about some of these things, and there will be some of that too. I just think we need to go back and rethink exactly what Jesus would be meaning to us. That's always the difficulty of the application. He wrote that to first century Christians, but He wrote that to us. And so we always have to ask ourselves, what is the application that He wants us to make in the 21st century? And I think that what I've talked about tonight is certainly most of what He's trying to say. You're going to have to stand up. And while you may not be persecuted like the original audience was persecuted, you're going to have to deal with things that are not going to be pleasant. We need to be willing to take a stand. I think that's one of the most difficult things for all of us to do. So I would encourage you tonight to make an evaluation of yourself. And just think back on the past year and situations you were in when you probably could have stood up and said some things that would lend an ear to the fact that you are a believer, when maybe you didn't do that. And I would suggest that we need to rejoice and be glad when we can stand up for what God wants and for what His Son wants from us. And I pray that we'll do that over the course of this year in even a better way. Hope those things will be helpful to you. Well, we're going to sing an invitation song, which Kyle will lead. And if we sing it to encourage anybody who is here tonight to respond to the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's always ultimately about responding. It may not be that you need to do something publicly, but I would hope every lesson, every service, every moment of the day, you're thinking about how you're responding to God. But if there's something that we can assist you with tonight, make that known while we stand and while we sing.